Welcome to the Resilient Training Lab podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the Resilient Training Lab podcast. I'm your host, Ryan, here with Coach Paul, and today we're going to be talking about training the person or the client that's in front of you. So joining us today as our guest is Kiefer Lammi. So welcome, Kiefer.
Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me.
We're very excited. I know you've worked with some of the people that we currently train in the past, so we're really excited to get your insight on what it's like when you're working with somebody in front of you. So we'd love to hear an update on where you're currently at. What's going on with your life before we jump in?
Sure. So right now, I think like a lot of people, I'm spending a lot of time in my own living room. As you can see, I've been working on some of my shrubbery over here, working on my cactus plants. But
looks great.
But no, honestly, I think the last couple of months I spent most of my time doing remote coaching with people that either I already was or people that have had to transition to that since, the COVID outbreak has kind of stunted some of the actual gym going.
So you're entirely remote right now, and even before the coronavirus?
I was for the last 3 to 6 months. I've been pretty much entirely remote. For those people that know me already, I was at Champion Physical Therapy and Performance in Massachusetts for like 3.5 years, and then eventually kind of broke off from that. And now this has been the majority of my work since.
How did the transition from working with people in person to completely being remote go? Were there a lot of differences that maybe you weren't expecting?
I think most of the differences were like for me personally, right? And like when we're working in person, we're so used to having a routine and having a schedule where, I know I'm at the gym from this time to this time. I know I'm going to see the people in front of me. Then when you go remote, it's like, the onus is all on you to create your own schedule and then to figure out how you're going to initiate communication with your clients. Whereas like for you guys, when you see people walk into the gym every day, you know that you're going to get to see their eyes. You're going to get to have that conversation about like how they're feeling, and you have a feeling of how training is going to go that day. But for me right now, it's very much like, all right, how can I start a text conversation or an email conversation with this person to like let them know that I care and actually get a feeling of what's going on with them outside of just, what they're writing down for their weights in their program.
I can imagine it'd be really challenging to convey how much you care or a lot of emotion when you're not face to face with this person and you're communicating exclusively through text.
For sure. It's definitely different. It's a whole different set of communication skills.
Now, I guess if we were to back it up and talk about when you are in person with somebody, I'd love to hear a little bit about how you start day one. Maybe how do you read the person in front of you, and what's the beginning of your assessment process like?
Sure. I think the assessment process, both, in person and online, but very much in person is about first trying to develop rapport with them and to get them to feel comfortable. I think a lot of times when people walk into the gym for the first time, like that's a really vulnerable thing for them. And, maybe they've had experiences in the past that didn't go well, or they've had no experiences. And so for some reason they're ending up with you. And rather than like going right ahead and trying to pick them apart and give them scores for things and stuff, trying to put them into a position where, they feel comfortable with you, they start to trust you is the most important thing. And so much of the other stuff you're going to figure out as you go.
When you mentioned that you had been working at Champion Physical Therapy, was that something that was similar between both the physical therapy clinic and the training that they were doing afterwards? Was there a lot of hesitation from the client or the patient that you had to work through in order to get them comfortable with starting to move with you and trust you as a coach?
I think the transition between PT and fitness at Champion was like one of the easiest things in the world. We always joke that it was like the easiest sale that we ever made, because all of the physical therapists that we have are like such good communicators, and they develop such a rapport one-on-one with their clients, largely because they're in an out of network setting where they can work one-on-one with them. And so, once they trust them, and then once they tell them that they're ready to come into fitness and work with us, like the selling's already done. So it's really just about like listening to them and then trying to put them in a position to be successful with their program right from the start.
And so when you're setting somebody up to be successful with their program, and we're looking at developing that program from the side of the trainer, how do you evaluate maybe what somebody's goals are? What's the conversation that you have with them that helps you shape exactly what their time will be spent doing inside of the gym?
Sure. So I think like starting off, it's very general questions about their goals, right? And you're waiting to hear those answers like, oh, like, I want to get a little bit leaner, or or I want to, build some muscle. Or sometimes you're lucky and you get people that are like, oh, like I want a back squat. And then the conversation's already had with them, right? But you're kind of taking these general ideas and then trying to follow up and pick away a little bit further by saying like, well, why do you feel like that's important to you? And like, why do you feel this way about that? And get to the root of it all, so that once, they've had their chance to speak, you've already got an idea in your head of like, all right, well, this is how I'd kind of set up a program that it's less threatening to introduce that idea to them. Because I think for a lot of people coming into the gym, like the vast majority of the people want some sort of outcome-based goal regarding like body composition, right? And for some people, it's not that easy of a sell to say that like, oh, strength training is the best way for you to lose weight and keep it off, right? But if you can get to like the root cause of why they feel the way that they do, and then you can have an honest conversation about like why you have the approach that you do, that it's a lot easier to put that program in front of them.
Yeah, I think that's a huge point, is people come in with these like kind of shallow goals where they're talking about, I want to get stronger, or I want to lose weight, or I want to look better naked. But if you really dig at it and, ask questions, there's really usually a deeper reason why that person's there, whether it be they, couldn't get up off the floor after playing with their kid, or they had trouble getting out of a super low chair at the beach or something like that. There's usually some kind of like exciting incident that happened that forced that person to come to you and ask for your assessment. So being able to have that conversation and use the assessment time to get to know people and build rapport, like you said, is huge, because you need to find out the real reason why, because we're trying to get people to, commit to this for the rest of their life. And when they have just shallow goals like I want to look better naked or get stronger, those fade away quickly. You got to find the real, root of why they're there.
Totally. And so like, that's why I think the communication portion of the assessment is so, so important. And it's not that I'm not going to do some degree of movement assessment with them, right? But that movement assessment is much more based now on like, all right, I know I want to squat. I know I want to hinge. I know I want to do pushing and pulling with this person. I'm going to go through this movement assessment. And basically, like, I'm looking to see if there's something so glaringly obvious that like we can't do one of these movements, because otherwise we're going to do everything, because I feel like everybody's able to do all of these things to some degree. It's just figuring out at what point on the spectrum we're starting and like where their entry point is into all of this, because I know that once I get somebody into the gym, that I can get them to start falling in love with strength training.
Exactly. I think my assessment process started out being like over an hour, and like the movement portion of it. And the further and further I got along in my career, the shorter and shorter that got. And
Right.
there's times that I spend less than 5 minutes watching someone move. Like, hey, do a squat, do a deadlift, do a bench press or push up, and do a row. And then that's it. It's like, after that, if you can't figure out, the correct entry point and how to build a program for them, then you're really missing the big picture there. Like you said, all that stuff you find out while you're training them, as you're coaching them.
Totally.
And you don't need to create that barrier of when they first come in, taking them through this like intricate assessment process and making them feel, more overwhelmed than they are stepping into the gym.
Yeah, for sure.
I think a lot of times those very clinical movement assessments can leave the potential client feeling vulnerable and exposed, and they're largely uncomfortable because they don't know you, and you're already going to start. Some people would start picking apart what they're doing when they're really sort of clueless on execution or what exactly it is that you're looking for. And I'm really curious to hear your insight, Kiefer, onto the programming stuff. But before we do get there, when you're setting up an assessment with the person for the first time, what does that look like? Is it something that's largely clinical? You have a clipboard and paper and you're sitting across from this person and talking to them? Is it in more of a relaxed office where they're not exposed to maybe 10 or 15 people who are out there lifting weights that they might find intimidating? If somebody were to walk through the door, what would they get?
I mean, as far as in-person assessment, I'll speak mostly to like what it was like when I was back at Champion, because I haven't done a ton in person since, honestly. But we tried to make it as laid back as we could while still being in the gym environment, right? So like, you guys can't see me right now, but I'm sitting with my feet up on the edge of my couch, kind of relaxing. Like, I'm not like hunched over the over the mic, like looking too serious about it. I think when it comes to that assessment with a person, like I try to make it feel as relaxed as possible because I want them to feel the same way. Right. And I want the conversation to be much more about dialogue and a lot less about me checking boxes off on a checklist. So in my head, I have this checklist of things that I want to go through, both in terms of the questions I ask them and then the movements we're going to go through. But I want it to feel very, very fluid and very much like we're just kind of going through this process together and we're learning about each other. And I'm able to provide some sort of education for them versus like I'm assessing them like when they go to the doctor's office.
Right. So less about, blood pressure and cholesterol numbers and a little
You're
bit
right.
more personal.
Right.
So let's say, and you brought this up earlier when you had talked about strength training possibly being a very efficient way for somebody to lose weight and keep it off, but they might not necessarily be ready to accept that. How do you deal with the person in front of you having a very different mindset than maybe one that you'd ideally like, right? You said somebody would come in and be like, yeah, I want a back squat. Great, easy. Let's go take a look at what your back squat is. But if somebody is really about maybe going for walks and doing yoga, which are both great activities, but maybe not necessarily the most efficient ones to get them to where they want to be, how do you go about that conversation where you're looking to offer new information to them?
Sure. I think the best thing you can do is make sure that they feel heard and then to try to educate them as honestly as possible. Right. So if somebody comes to me and, they want to lose weight and stuff and they're dead set on like high intensity interval training and going for walks and yoga is the way that they do their exercise. Like, first of all, awesome, because I want to see somebody being active in any way possible. Right. But I'm also going to try to introduce them to the idea of strength training and the benefit that it's going to have in addition to that. So maybe instead of trying to like bash what they're doing and overhaul it and replace it with strength training altogether, maybe we say, hey, let's try strength training twice a week. Okay, you're still going to go to yoga. I still want you to work on getting your steps in and going for your walks. You can still do a HIIT class once a week, but I want to try strength training twice a week. I want to make sure we're resting once or twice a week. And then let's try to take care of your nutrition as well. And, and once they start to see that, you care about what they're doing, you're trying to educate them and you're trying to help add to what they're doing instead of taking things away from them, I think that it becomes much easier to continue to push the ball in your favor.
Yeah, so I think that's a point that a lot of strength coaches miss is when someone comes in and, they're doing stuff that is not, beneficial towards their goals. Yoga and steps are a bad example because any NEAT is good for your goals. But, if someone comes in with, some beliefs and expectations that are against your principles, training principles, then all too often coaches are going to kind of like put down that person for what they're doing. And as soon as you do that, you've lost them because, they've spent however many months or years doing these activities with the belief that it was helping them. And if you go there and say, that was stupid, why are you doing that? You're wasting your time. They're not going to listen to a word you have to say. So being able to kind of agree with the person and meet them where they currently are is huge and is kind of the theme of this podcast.
Sure. Yeah. And I think either you're going to lose them for it or you're going to get them on your side through fear. And both of which are like equally damaging to what they're doing, right? Because now you've got them afraid to do the thing that they were previously doing and enjoyed doing.
Yeah. And it really comes down to enjoyment at the end of the day. Because if people aren't enjoying what they're doing, or at least enjoying the process or the community they're with, they're not going to come back. And adherence drives all progress. Like you could do the crappiest program in the world, 5-6 days a week and see way better progress than if you had a massively built program that you never did.
Yeah, entirely. Yeah.
So while we're on the topic of programming, I know you had mentioned that when you're writing for somebody, you are going to incorporate some sort of squat, a hinge, a push, a pull. What do you necessarily look for on day one or day two, whenever it is when you're having this person exercise in front of you for the first time? What are the big things that you're looking at to develop their first block or their first program?
I think, first program with somebody, I'm trying to keep it relatively basic. I think I'm pretty heavily inspired by like what Dan John does or Mike Robertson does, and that you're really just addressing the hinge, the squat, push, pull, single leg work, loaded carries, right? Are kind of foundational movements. And I think as far as goals for the person, I want to teach them the role of intent as early as possible, right? Like you're not just doing 10 squats, but I want you to do 10 squats with an appropriate load that feels challenging by the end, right? So you start to have an idea of what progressive overload is going to look like for that person over time. And I just want them to feel successful and in control of the movements that they're doing, right? Like I don't care as much about the movement looking perfect, whatever perfect might mean to me or to someone else. I care that they feel comfortable doing it, that it's not causing them sort of pain or they're not afraid while they're doing the movement. And so I think once you kind of nail down those two things, it's really easy to start to push progress forward for that person.
So is this person looking at a 10-minute movement assessment on day one with you, or is this something that you're saving for the next visit to the gym? And how do you frame maybe going out onto the gym floor with them?
Sure. So on like an assessment and intake day, a lot of times what I would try to do is, we're going to talk about their goals. Then we're going to go through some basic movement patterns. And then ideally, I like to get them on the gym floor and I want to do a couple movements with them because I want them to start to get comfortable in the environment we're going to come to on day 2. But I also want to see how receptive they are to cueing and coaching, right? So I want to give them a light kettlebell. I want to say, all right, let's start in about a shoulder width stance, toes turned out a little, and I want to see you do a couple squats. And then based on what they do, maybe I give them 1 or 2 simple cues and I can just see like how receptive they're going to be to that. So that when we come in for day 2, like maybe I'm not going to bombard them with 10 or 12 different cues. Maybe I know I can just give them this one simple thing and things will go pretty well. Or maybe I know like, all right, this is pretty intimidating for this person. So I want to pick movements that I know they can be most successful with, that I don't have to give them a ton of cueing because I want them to feel more autonomous. I want them to feel good about what they're doing on their own before I introduce more complex movements for them.
Yeah. So when you're taking them out there and you have someone and you ask them to do a squat and it's absolutely atrocious, are you just going to like sit there and pick them apart and try and fix it? Or are you going to maybe regress it and find a movement that they can do more successfully without, the million cues?
I'm 100% just going to try to regress it to a point that they're going to feel successful with, right? Like we talked about before, I know we're going to squat in 99% of cases. I just want to know like where on the spectrum of squats we're going to start. So if I start with a light kettlebell with them and, it's just a straight up bodyweight squat and they feel totally uncomfortable, maybe I have them, sit to a bench and push a plate out in front of them. Right. So we're still going to start to get used to that squat pattern, but now they feel a little bit less threatened. They have this target to shoot for by sitting down. Maybe we spend a couple of weeks squatting to a box before we go to something else. But outside of that, like people sit down and get up off the toilet and the couch every day. Like even if it doesn't look super pretty, I'm totally okay with them doing a box squat any way that they choose to do it.
So you're not obsessing over whether or not it looks perfect at the start, especially if someone comes in and they've never squatted ever before. Just kind of let them do the movement and let them learn on their own. Because when someone first comes in, I guarantee you they're not strong enough to hurt themselves.
Right. They're not strong enough to hurt themselves. And there are very few things at that level of fitness that can't be fixed by just talking about like, oh, let's get your weight back into your heels a little bit, or, oh, keep your chest up to me just a little bit. And I don't think that cues need to be super complex or need to be super intimidating for them in order for them to get a positive training effect.
Yes, what you just talked about, finding a variation of their movement that somebody can be successful with, is just setting up little victories for this client so that when they come in, they're feeling confident and capable. Are there any other little victories that you might set up in the first few visits of the gym in order to get this person building some momentum?
I think one of the things that I try to do for people that it's appropriate for, or for movements that appropriate for, is leave rep ranges pretty open-ended. So say for example, like I know this person can do like 5 to 8 push-ups in a row, right? Well, we might do your first couple sets are sets of 4, and then your last set I want to do as many as we can. I know that push-ups are probably not a movement that's going to hurt them in any way. I know it's something we can push a little closer to failure. Maybe we do that AMRAP set at the end and they get 6 reps. And I say, all right, awesome. Next time we come in, we're going to do the same thing, but I want you to try and get 7 reps on this exercise. And so as silly and simple as that is, it's just such a quick way for them to start to see that they're making progress with the movements they're doing outside of needing to put a heavier weight into their hand, because some people just aren't ready to hold something heavier. Even if they're strong enough, they just don't know it yet.
I think you mentioned something big there, is being able to do kind of the same thing week after week and progressing on it instead of
Yeah.
changing what you're doing every week. Because if you're changing what you're doing every week, it's way harder to kind of create those small wins. But if you're doing push-ups for 6 weeks in a row and you're doing one extra push-up each week, like you're going to be excited to come in the next time and try and get that extra push-up. So I think it's important that you're able to create small wins through progressive overload and teach people about progressive overload through programming and through kind of the way you coach.
Totally. Well, and I think that that's why, getting people in the mindset of treating their training and their strength training as a skill versus a workout is so important, right? Because any of us that, you played sports or something else know that in order to get better at the skill that you're doing, you need to do the same thing repeatedly. You need to do a lot of it, and you have to really work to get better at it. And that's what drives people and gets them excited to come back into practice of whatever sort, right? But if they're coming to the gym and they're just seeking a workout and they just want to get buried and they just want to sweat really hard, then you're seeking that novelty every time you come in because you're always looking for something harder or something different. So, squat, bench, deadlift, gymnastic skills, weightlifting, whatever it happens to be, these things can be so powerful for people at a certain point because it gets them to treat their workouts like training versus just like this workout.
I think you brought up something really interesting when we talked about push-ups. You said they're not even aware of maybe how capable they are with a weight in their hands. And so when you have a beginner, especially within those first few sessions or the first few weeks of training with you, are there any ways that you start to teach them what working hard feels like? Because it's not uncommon for us to see somebody who might tell us that they have 1 or 2 reps left over, and then you give them an AMRAP and they bang out an extra 10 reps.
Yeah. I honestly, I think you just nailed it. I think that's exactly what I do is, you try to find those places where you can give them an open-ended rep range and just let them prove to their self that they can do that much more. And I think that it just starts to feed itself from there, and it builds their confidence, and they know that they're able to do more after that.
Sure. And so taking a set to failure definitely feels a lot different than maybe a heavy single. So, Paul, are there any ways specifically that you would teach somebody what a heavy single feels like versus what AMRAPs feel like?
Yeah, usually something that clicks with those people when you're trying to get them used to heavy singles is that feeling of, the last rep of a rep set. So if, they've taken a set to 5 to failure, or they've taken a set of 8 to failure, the way that last rep feels is how that single should feel. And when we're doing one rep, it might feel a little bit different in terms of, less muscular burn and more kind of total body tension. But that feeling of wanting to quit is still the same. And that's really what we're paying attention to is how close are we to, saying screw this and, and dumping it. So when you think about how that last rep feels and the effort you gave in an AMRAP set on that last rep and the kind of misery you were in, that's how your singles should feel. And all too often people get scared because the singles are heavier and they unrack it and they're like, oh man, this feels so heavy. And they automatically, before they even do the rep, start to kind of assess the RPE and give it an 8 or a 9 just because it feels heavy in their hands. But it's really not about how the weight feels. It's about how, the effort you give to make the movement happen. So when you're looking at the last rep of an AMRAP versus how that heavy single feels, the effort there should be similar.
How about you, Kiefer? Is there some way that you address maybe effort levels or intensities with new clients?
No, I think it's very, very similarly, right? People often learn early on what hard feels like, but in terms of fatigue on higher rep sets. And I think over time, you progressively start to get them more comfortable with the idea of that same thing at a higher intensity or at a lower rep set. I think, introducing things like different tempos and isometric holds that get them used to feeling an uncomfortable amount of tension or get them used to this idea of grinding through something really slowly is super helpful. And then eventually you just kind of slowly tick forward to the point where the weight actually is that heavy, where every rep feels that way.
Yeah, and it's a learning process, right? When someone new comes in, even if you have them do an AMRAP, they might not actually take it to failure just because they don't know how to push that hard. So they'll still stop like 5 reps short of failure, and you'll look at them and be like, man, that wasn't an AMRAP. And they're like sucking wind and looking at you like you're crazy. And that's another skill that needs to be evolved as you're training. You're not going to come in day one and be able to give 100% intensity. And in fact, that's kind of what separates, an intermediate lifter from an advanced lifter, is the ability to put all their force they have into the bar at once. And that's why you see these big, strong guys, do like 2 deadlift sessions a month and still make progress, because the central nervous system activity that's going on when you pull 900 plus pounds is way different than when you pull 200 pounds, even if that's your quote unquote max at the time.
Totally.
And so we've been talking about everything in sort of an ideal scenario. We've covered all these topics. When the person's in front of us, we can have a conversation with them, read their reactions and their body language, and have efficient conversations and sessions and really moving them along. And if you're working with somebody online, I get the idea that that would be a lot less efficient. Am I wrong in that?
It's definitely not as easy, right? You don't get to have that real-time conversation with people. I think what changes is like the client is now forced to be more autonomous than they might be comfortable with, right? And so what becomes really evident right away is like how in tune they are with their bodies, or how well educated they are on the way that their strength training is supposed to feel, which, is kind of a reflection of how much education you gave them when you were in front of them, if you had a chance to be prior to this.
So if you encountered a scenario with a client where you might need to reframe what they think is hard, or maybe what their strength training should look like, right? Because if somebody is invested enough in training that they sought out somebody who's educated to do their programming, and they're working with a coach remotely, they're probably pretty invested in their strength training career, but maybe they took a turn or adopted a philosophy that might be holding them back a little bit. How do you go about those conversations with somebody who you don't have face to face?
I don't know, man. I think it's just about communication and asking a lot of questions, right? Asking a lot of questions about, how they're feeling, why they're feeling the way that they are. And then it becomes a lot easier to start to address, how you feel they should be looking at their training, or the things that you think that they could do to get the most out of it when they're on their own.
Paul, is that something that you have experienced in the past with people that you train?
Yeah, and it's definitely tougher in the remote setting because you're probably only getting to check in once a week. But at the end of the day, it's not that huge of a deal, because the way we kind of coach in person, we talk about not cueing the person while they're in the middle of a lift, and not trying to give them too much feedback like in a session or during a set. In person, you can kind of let the person do like one set, give them feedback, and they can apply it to the next set. So it's a little more efficient. But online, you still get to see the person, lift on a weekly basis, and you still get to give that feedback that they can apply to the next week. So just because it's not in real time doesn't mean that you still can't be efficient with your feedback and be able to focus on, 1 or 2 cues like you would do in person, and get that person to focus on those things in the next week and then report back to you with how it is. And to be honest, it might be even a better situation to kind of teach self-efficacy in some people that aren't super familiar with lifting weights, because they're forced to do it on their own for the week and come check in with you at the end of the week and then apply that feedback. They don't get that instant feedback, so it gives their brain some time to try and learn those movements on their own and start to feel what feels best. And you'll be surprised kind of at the revelations some remote clients make on their own when you're able to kind of guide them and educate them correctly.
Yeah, I think, one thing that I've tried to do is you make their training logs when you're working remotely with them very reflective, right? So I might program in things to a certain RPE or an RIR, or I might program in AMRAPs and everything. But what I want is for their notes after the fact to be not just them recording, the weight they use or the number of reps, but I want them to, show me a video, but I also want them to write down like how they actually felt when they finished the set. Because I think the more time that they spend, actually thinking about, how close to failure they were versus just what they assumed they were going to be before the set, and so they stopped the set when they got to that point, the more they start to learn about themselves and their training. And so, I have them kind of treat their training log like a diary at the end. They reflect on the way things were. We check in once or twice a week, and we just talk about how we can kind of continue to push the needle forward and make sure that they're getting the right training stimulus.
I think that's really interesting. What are some of the comments that you've gotten in that diary after their sets are done?
From most people, I very rarely see somebody write down that they overshot their RPE, right? A lot of times it's like finish the set and they're like, probably had a few extra reps in the tank, right? So right away, we know what we can expect for the next week. So I might already go into their next week of programming and make a note of, what they said the previous week or how they felt, or give them a strategy for, warming up to that set so they feel more prepared to push it a little harder. But I think it's really cool because I think, kind of like we talked about, most, non-competitive individuals in the gym will almost always undershoot, their intensity or undershoot how capable they are with certain weights, right? Because they just don't like have it in their head. They're not as crazy as Paul is to want to push sets that close to failure that frequently.
Paul, I see you giggling over there. What was going on in your head?
Kelsey.
I think even when Paul programmed for me for a while, I don't know that there was like one session where I actually hit my prescribed RPE on an AMRAP set or on a top set.
Yeah, and then the feedback always is, "Hey man, stop dogging it. You got more in you."
Right. But it's scary, and it's scary. Like even for someone like myself, who I feel like I've trained pretty hard for a number of years, I still don't like the feeling of feeling like that close to failing very often, right? And it's such a skill that needs to be ingrained, and I think that's why you have, and I know I have adopted this training style of like heavy singles before your volume work, whatever you're doing so regularly. It's like that's a different feeling than you're going to get from anything else.
I think we might have dug up a little bit of a different stance between the two of you, right? You're both accomplished coaches, but I think after working with Paul for like maybe 6 months, you don't seem to place too much stock in what somebody feels like after they complete a set, do you?
No, not really. I'll take note on if they are complaining about feeling like beat up and run down, but on like a day-to-day basis, not too concerned how they feel after a set unless they're reporting pain. So I'm more concerned about them completing the volume that they have assigned to them, one, and two is putting themselves in a position to progress, and whether that be kind of assessing their RPE honestly and having a conversation with them about that and where they can go next session, or I guess it's the same thing in a positive or a negative way. If someone comes in and they do a set at an RP of 8 and I'm watching it and I'm like, that's not really an 8. And I can go up to them and talk to them and be like, hey, how'd that feel? In that sense, or vice versa, if they overshoot it and I come up and be like, hey, how'd that feel? I'm more looking for their assessment of RPE versus my assessment of their RPE and kind of talking and figuring out where we really are. Because, just watching someone's lift, you can't really tell what the RPE is. I mean, I've seen thousands and thousands of lifts, so I can kind of get a general idea of what, an RP 8 looks like, an RP 7 looks like. But that's different from person to person, and that's different even from day to day with the person. You could have come in with a horrible night's sleep and not eaten and do a set that's an RP of 8 and it feels like an 8 to you because you feel like shit, but it doesn't really look like an 8. So the conversation is more to talk about, like why is there a discrepancy in what I feel you did and what you actually did.
Sure. Totally. It just helps you to get on the same page with the person, start to understand how they think with this stuff. And I think one thing it's helped for me is like, you can kind of categorize people as the chronic under-raters and the chronic over-raters, right? And I might be more likely to program regular 8s or an 8.5 for somebody that I know is really only hitting like a 7 on their top set. But for the person that's like, I'm like always face palming because they missed their top single that was supposed to be at a 7, I might be less likely to why.
Yeah, and I think that's something we do in our programming too. In my programming, Eric Lagoy does my programming, he knows that I always overshoot my RPEs, and like I'll have a volume block where the highest RPE will be like an RP of 6, and I doubt I ever actually follow that. I probably overshoot those too, and he knows that, so he always programs in less RPE.
Yeah.
Versus someone who chronically undershoots, I'm throwing 9s and even some 10s in there, where I wouldn't really ever put in RP 9 or 10 in a regular person's program. So it's huge to kind of get to know the person in front of you and their tendencies and program accordingly.
And that's the art of coaching, right? Is it's starting to like understand and communicate with this person. It's not like who can make the most creative training program on a piece of paper. It's how are you going to make it fit the person so that they get the most effective training stimulus out of it.
Yeah, because you could have a training template that you spent hours and hours thinking out, but unless you have someone you're writing it for, it could be completely useless, because depending on the person's goals and depending on their training history and all sorts of other factors, their training is going to need to look different than the person next to them.
Right. Like, I sit in the Facebook groups for different training programs that I've bought over the years, and I just watch the comments go through and stuff. And they're training programs from like very successful businesses and people. And you see the notes all the time. You'll see one person that writes in and it's like, hey, I'm feeling really banged up from all the volume. What should I do if I need to cut back? And literally the next comment will be somebody else like, hey, can I add extra accessory work to this if I'm not feeling like it's enough? Like these things are so different from person to person.
I mean, we even see that in the science. You'll see like a research article and the conclusion was that everything was super successful, but then you look at the individual data and overall people were successful with whatever modality they studied, but there's always a group that didn't respond or even responded negatively to that. So training is very individual, and being able to work with a coach that can work with you to make that happen is huge.
For sure.
So let's jump into efficiency, because it's something you guys keep bringing up when it comes to not just writing programs, but lifestyle factors. So if we're talking about the big rocks that fill the jar, what are those big rocks when it comes to helping people get to where they want to be? And what do you guys place a lot of stock in terms of habits and, I guess, regular check-ins?
Paul, you want to start off?
Sure. So the biggest thing we're looking at is that person's lifestyle and kind of the habits they have, and then figuring out what they're struggling with the most and attacking that. So you mentioned big rocks and filling the jar. I'll give the whole analogy. But if you have rocks, pebbles, sand, and water, if you put the water in and then the sand in and then the pebbles, you'll have no room for the big rocks. But if you put the big rocks in first, you can fit all that stuff into the same size jar. So we want to be able to assess the person in front of us and find out what those big rocks are. And most of the time it's sleep and moving every day. Is, people come to you and they'll be like, man, I feel like shit all the time. I don't know why. And you start talking to them and you find out they sleep 5 hours a night and take like 1,000 steps a day. And you're like, well, there it is. Like, that's an easy fix. That's something that we can attack right away. And it's like, hey, like, start small. Like, hey, why don't you try taking 500 extra steps this week and build up from there? And I think sometimes with these big rocks is, we all have these ideals like, oh, you should be taking 10,000 steps, sleeping 7 to 9 hours. But when someone comes to us and they're so far off from those things, it's, again, creating that barrier or creating more stress than needs to be when you're telling someone who only takes 1,000 steps a day that they need to take 10,000 steps a day. So finding the things that they're struggling with the most and then putting in a plan to make them successful in slowly and progressively overloading their capacity there and starting to build up on things they're doing outside of the gym. Because, you hear it all the time. We only spend 1, maybe 2 hours with somebody, and then the next 23, 22 hours, they are on their own. And if we don't educate them to kind of take care of themselves outside of the gym, all the stuff we do inside the gym will kind of be, moot.
Yeah, totally. I think you nailed it. And I think, kind of going back to that point that I think is super important about, if somebody's getting 1,000 steps a day or they're sleeping 4 hours a night, like we're not necessarily concerned with them all of a sudden jumping to this ideal that we set forth of like 10,000 steps and, sleeping 8 hours a night and strength training 5 days a week. It's very similar to how we talked about like the idea of assessing somebody and figuring out where on the spectrum of movement they're going to fall. Like, I don't expect somebody that's brand new to fitness in general to all of a sudden be back squatting heavy when they come to the gym. I would like to start with a squat pattern, right? And I would like for them to understand that there's this kind of spectrum that they're going to move along, but I only need them to take one step. So if somebody's starting off and like, they're eating like shit and, they're getting 1,000 to 2,000 steps a day and they're not sleeping well, like, all right, well, let's figure out a way that we can get to 3,000 steps a day. And let's figure out a way that we can like introduce some veggies into your diet. And let's try to get, an extra hour of sleep. And all of a sudden this like one step at a time process starts to lead to where you're going. But if you overwhelm them and we try to make them perfect right away, that you're probably causing more stress than good. And it's, very similarly to a crash diet, like it might work really well, really quickly, but then they're not going to be able to sustain that.
Yeah, they all kind of play off each other. If you're getting someone to slowly increase their NEAT, they're going to be more tired at the end of the day, and they're going to sleep better because they were more active during the day. Right. If you're getting someone on a good training program and, Sunday night they're used to boozing up and having a crappy night's sleep, but Monday morning they come into the gym and they have whatever heavy squats or heavy deadlifts, they're going to start thinking twice about what they do on Sunday night because they're sick of coming in Monday morning and feeling like crap. So when you start to kind of pick away at these things, they start to feed on each other, and people start to kind of realize how they all affect each other. And as those positive effects start to build, people get momentum, and they, you can make very big and lasting changes by focusing on, I don't want to use the word small, but I guess some of these small things.
Yeah, for sure.
Yes. I mean, let's say, I've got my sleep under control. I do plenty of steps, but resistance training just isn't happening. You gave the example of somebody having crappy squats after boozing on Sunday, but how do you even ensure that that person gets to the gym on Monday? Like, what do you guys do to increase the likeliness that somebody even shows up to the gym? Because it's probably the hardest part about training, right? At least in the beginning for a lot of people.
Paul, what do you do?
So for us, it's about community. I mean, it's about the community that we've built with Resilient and the friends that people make training. And I think I can speak for a lot of the people we train that the people they train with are their main friend group. They, they're not going to the bars boozing every night because, training has become important to them. And they start to build relationships with the people they're training with. And that's really who kind of is the main reason people keep coming back. It's like, hey, I work out with the same people at 5 o'clock in the morning every morning. And if I'm gone for 2 days, they're going to be texting me, asking me where I'm at. So I better show up even if I don't feel like it. And then, the other things we were talking about, keeping things simple, creating small wins, and creating that buy-in from that person. And, Kiefer mentioned it earlier, is letting them do what they want and kind of finding how you can make what they like to do effective, and then start to sprinkle in the things that they need to do, and then start to see, what they like, because there's a million ways to skin the cat. So if you're throwing a lot of different things at them at first and, they really like one style of training, or they really like, going heavy, or they really like doing more kind of conditioning based volume circuits, whatever that may be, you find, what they enjoy, and you start to program for them based on what they enjoy. And as they start to buy in more and more, you can fit in more and more of that stuff that they don't enjoy, and starting to educate them on why they need to be doing the things that they don't like. I always tell people, it's like, those things you don't like are probably the things you need to be doing most, because we tend to gravitate towards things we're good at, and we like to do things we're good at. But again, talking about those low-hanging fruits is trying to find the things we're bad at and attacking them, because there's way more room for progression in those areas.
Yeah. I love it. And that's kind of why I wanted you to go first on the whole thing related to, accountability and get people in the gym, is that like, I know that the community you guys have created has been so powerful for that. Right. And like, that's something that's really challenging when you work with remotely with people, is you don't have any face-to-face accountability for them to show up and to get their training in, right? Like, I hope that them paying me a couple $100 a month is enough for them to be held accountable to it. But for some people, it's not. And so I think that it goes back to, how well did you establish rapport with this person? How much do they feel supported by you and know that you care, to the point where like they genuinely feel held accountable by the fact that, this person that's invested in you, might be let down or feel disappointed if you're not getting into the gym and training.
What are some of the ways that you create accountability with your remote clients? Does everybody have to check in the same number of times? Do some people check in more frequently? Does everybody have to record the training that they're doing on video? How do you approach that?
Honestly, it's super individual. I have some people that are so just intrinsically motivated and enjoy training so much that I know I don't have to worry about them for that. And, our check-ins throughout the week become much more conversational and just kind of shooting the shit, because I know that they don't need that sort of push in the right direction. I have other people that really struggle with it. And whether it's, because of work or stress from something else, the gym is just a really hard thing for them to put into their day. And so, our conversations become much more exercises in figuring out how we can set them up for small wins, set them up for success with this. Do we need to change the time of day that you're setting up for training? Do we need to, write down a list of your priorities for the day and kind of schedule out where training is going in? I want you to send me a video of you doing an exercise from the gym so that, you feel held accountable to doing your training when you said you were going to. And, it's different for everybody, but it just comes down to that communication.
Yeah, those seem like really great ways to ensure that the people that you're programming for are at least doing something. And all of these factors that can influence our training, like you had mentioned, changing the time of day or the style of training, and all of these factors that we do have the flexibility to adjust, can go a long way in ensuring the success of the client. Paul, do you create accountability across the board for everybody in the same way, or do you fluctuate with how you handle your remote clients?
Yeah, I think like Kiefer said, a big part of it is showing them that you care. I mean, this is in person too, is being invested in that person's progress. And it has to be genuine. Like, I can honestly say the best part of my job is, watching people PR and, the reactions that happen afterwards. And I get more hyped up about people PRing than they do. And when they start to see that, and they start to see that you're invested in their progress and that you believe in them, maybe sometimes more than they believe in themselves, it goes a long way, because like Kiefer said, they start to kind of get scared that they're going to let you down if, you miss a training session. And it's huge to be able to kind of show people that, you're the biggest fan, because everyone is their harshest critic. And it's very hard for someone to give themselves those small wins. So as a coach, you got to be there to constantly point them out and show them that, they really are progressing, even if they don't feel like it. Because I know all of us have been there, because like I said, everyone's their own worst critic. Is when you're, in the middle of a training cycle, it's easy to get disencouraged if you have, one or two bad training sessions. But when you are able to step back and look at the big picture and see where you really come from, you can see all that progress that you've made. And as a coach, it's sometimes our job to make people take that step back and look at all that progress they made. Because at the end of the day, I think progress is the main reason people stick around. Like at first, it's about, like we talked about earlier, about creating an environment they can be successful in, something that they enjoy. But as someone gets more and more serious about lifting weights, that fun isn't always going to be there, but the progress and the journey is. And when you fall in love with that progress and journey, that's when you've really turned fitness into like a lifelong endeavor.
Yeah. No, I think that's awesome. I think, as much as we talk about like the accountability and, not wanting to let somebody else down, I think at the same time on the opposite end of the spectrum, like you're talking about with truly caring about these people and their success, like I want my clients to know that I care about them the way that I care about family, and that whether things are going great or things are going super poorly, that's okay. And you're still a good person. And, you can be upset or you can be having a hard time with things, and, nobody's to fault for that. And I'm not upset with you for that. But at the same time, like, we're going to figure out a strategy to make it better. right? And so I think that's where the accountability comes in. It's like, I want them to feel comfortable enough to not have to hide from me if something doesn't go well or they missed a couple of training sessions in a row. But I also want them to know that, like, all right, I'm going to come back with a strategy because we're not going to dwell on this. And I care about us continue to making this progress.
I think that's largely relevant. And we talked about this in our Corona episode, just where it's okay to be having a hard time and it's okay if you're not where you want to be. But the effort or the striving to improve should be held constant. And as long as we're doing our best to move forward, then we will find a strategy for the person to be successful, whether it's changing the training plan, modifying lifestyle factors, or whatever it is. We're here to try over and over again until we do find success.
Yeah.
Yeah. If a person's coming to us and they're putting forth their best effort, it's our job to make sure that they're going in the right direction. And, progress isn't going to be linear. There's going to be slumps, and there's going to be times that you are stagnant, and there's going to be times you make jumps. And being able to recognize that and start to kind of learn about all the lessons strength training has to teach you outside of the gym is huge, because as everyone that has been training for a long time knows, that there's a lot of obstacles, and it's not ever a pretty straight line. So being able to kind of, again, fall in love with the process, trust the process, and put forth your best effort no matter what is all you can really do. The rest of it's kind of up to us to lead you in the right direction.
Yeah.
All right, so before we wrap this up, I feel like we've been thrust into your domain of online coaching, right? With the way things are now and gyms being shut down. So I guess we're asking for a little bit of advice or tips, right? So when it comes to creating engagement online, what do you find to drive the most interaction or responses from your clients? Is it purely just content they like learning? Or is there some sort of like magic secret that you've got when it comes to all of this Instagram success and this online world?
Well, I certainly wouldn't say that I have all this Instagram success, but I think because a lot of the people that I work with were remote training clients before the current situation, right? They're used to sort of the way that we communicate and do things, right? So they're all used to communicating with me one-on-one. They're used to us having, not just comments and feedbacks on their training program, but like they're used to having text conversations with me a couple times a week about everything, right? So these people are genuinely like friends that I don't get to see face to face in person. So as we got, into this phase of things, that stayed constant. And then I honestly just like looked to them for help. I asked a few of them like, hey, what can I do to kind of bring some community together during this to help everybody stay a little bit more accountable, because I know that it's challenging. Social media is, it's a reflection of, it should be a reflection of who you are as a coach or as a person, right? So if you're a coach that, really likes to educate people on how to move, then it's a great opportunity to, post a lot of training videos. And I don't think that, the COVID crisis is a reason for you to change who you are or to do something totally different from that. If you're a coach that's like really passionate about the way you communicate with your people and the way you build community, then, amplifying that by like what you guys are doing with the podcast and with more community gatherings and having these happy hours and stuff is like the perfect way to leverage social media to help serve your community. I think that the people that are struggling or the people that are coming across as inauthentic are the ones that are searching for like this magic pill to fix everything for them right now while we're going through this crisis. It's like very apparent the people that are doing something that's not a reflection of who they were as a coach or who they were as a business, just because they're afraid right now. And I don't blame them for that, but like, it's clear,
Can't fake authenticity.
Yeah.
So what about flipping the roles there, Kiefer? Because you had mentioned when you started working with remote people that these were largely people that you had interacted with face-to-face and in a group setting. How did you handle going from coaching however many people it was at a time to now having to remotely interact one-on-one, the complete opposite of what in-person coaching is all about?
honestly, I can't say that I have a super hard time with it. I definitely miss coaching in person. I really enjoy coaching in person and working with people and, giving people a hard time and shooting the shit. But I'm like naturally a little bit more introverted and I enjoy my alone time. And so being able to communicate with them, through text or through my computer hasn't honestly been that hard of a transition for me. So I feel fortunate in that sense.
Can't play Pokemon on the training floor.
Right.
That wouldn't send the right message to potential clients, right?
That would not.
So like when you have a client come to you and we talked about, someone who has prior expectations and beliefs that might not kind of fit into your training philosophies. When you have someone that comes to you who's, really into the education side of things and has done a lot of kind of research on their own, so much so that they've kind of put themselves in a crippling position where they've, read all these things by all these different strength coaches that tell them they can't do a certain activity if they're not able to hit certain prerequisites. And, you have someone come in, we'll use the back squat example. Someone comes in and like, oh, I can't squat. Someone told me my hip doesn't internally rotate enough. So I've just been doing Z-chair front foot elevated split squats. And, you want to kind of push them towards doing a bilateral squat of some sorts. Like, how do you have that conversation with someone who's kind of already entrenched in the field and you don't want to offend them, but you need to get them training because they've kind of pigeonholed themselves?
Yeah, of course you give me the hard questions. I think a lot of it comes from understanding, right? So if you ask them enough questions, you can start to understand why they feel a certain way. And then, either they realize that they kind of talk themselves in a circle and what they're saying might not make as much sense as they thought, or it just gives you an opportunity to, acknowledge their beliefs, right? It's perfectly valid for them to believe that, but try to introduce another thought for them that might not be totally threatening to what they currently believe, right? So, you talk about this certain scenario of like somebody being told they can't bilateral squat. Well, maybe we're not trying to force them into a back squat right away, even though, that might be your end goal. Maybe we try to start to introduce some goblet squatting for them, or you start to introduce front squatting or a Zercher squat or something that's more similar to the thing that they have deemed as safe for them to do. Right. And then educate them on like why you feel like it's important to start to progress them down this path, like why you feel like your ability to load and get an appropriate stimulus with the movements they're doing might be kind of stunted. And if we could start to introduce these other movements, that they could see more progress. And once they start to understand that like your motives are not about necessarily like forcing your own agenda or your own methodology, and they're much more about helping them reach their goals the best way you know how, I think it's a lot easier to push them in that direction.
Yeah, I think that's huge that, you're able to communicate with them and talk to them about why they believe certain things, because you can gain a lot of insight from, why they believe in those things and why they think certain things are harmful. And then you can create situations that, kind of prove them wrong. Like you said, is, if they're scared to bilateral back squat, maybe you have them goblet squat and you ask them after, hey, how'd that feel? Like, did you have any pain? Did it hurt? Like, were you successful? And when they can honestly say yes to that question is when you've kind of started to dig in and able to push them a little bit further. So, maybe they get that goblet squat in and they're like, oh, that felt pretty good. So you try maybe like a double front rack squat or a Zercher squat and start to progress them more towards that back squat. And then, like you said, the other big thing is being able to have a reason why. We need to have a reason why in everything we do. And this all plays together is like people get so caught up in, the intricacies of fitness that they miss those big rocks. It's like everything we've been talking about is they miss those big rocks and they get caught up in the pebbles and the sand, and then their jar, they don't have room for their big rocks in the jar. So being able to, show them that and show them like why we want to do certain movements, why they're safe, and then start to change their beliefs in a more active way than just talking at them.
Yeah. I think that's why, like, whether you believe in the thing or not, I think it's so important to gain an education on like all the different things that are going on in fitness, right? Because there's all these different methodologies. Some of them are on the surface level drastically different from one another. A lot of times, if you go a little bit deeper, they're not saying things that are that much different from one another. But the better that we as coaches understand all of these methodologies, even if it's not something that you're necessarily going to use in your own practice, the easier it is to talk to some of these clients that might be coming from that camp. Because, like, unfortunately, a lot of the more polarizing opinions in fitness are the ones that get more attention. So sooner or later, you're going to get clients that come across that information or come to you from a coach that, kind of fell under that umbrella. And if you just kind of shit on things and tell them that they're wrong, you're not going to help them, or you're not going to keep them in the doors. But if you have an understanding of where they're coming from and you can kind of meet them halfway and show that maybe you are educated on that topic as well as something else that you believe more in, that it's just that much easier to work with them.
That was definitely a mistake I made early on in my career. New grad walking out with so much knowledge, and I have a client sitting in front of me who is explaining to me their goals and telling me what they're doing. I'm like, no, that's the total opposite. Like, here's what we're going to do. And they wouldn't come back. And it
Right.
took me longer than I'd like to admit
Right.
to find a system that kept them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Unfortunately, sleeping 8 hours, walking every day, and eating like an adult isn't super sexy.
Yeah, and like strength training a couple times a week, like sell well, but when you package something as something hyper specific, it does. Right. And
yeah,
like, I got asked this, I don't know, a month or two ago, and it just sticks with me. Somebody asked like what methodology I most identify with. And I literally couldn't answer the question because I like didn't know how to label it or anything, because I consider myself to be such a mutt of like all of the things that I picked up or learned over the years. Right. And so like I genuinely have an appreciation for pretty much all of the different camps that are out there. Right. The thing that, I have a hard time with is some of the people that fall under the umbrella of these camps that think that that's the only thing that works or is right in our industry. And that's where it's really challenging, is when they can't, see their thing for what it is as like a valuable piece to the whole. And they think that you're not right if you're not doing that.
Yeah. Everything is valuable to someone and nothing is valuable to everybody. So getting stuck into, one camp of training philosophy is not going to do your clients, the most benefit that you can, because, with that one training school of thought, you'll be able to really help maybe one type of person, but the next type of person you won't be able to help at all. So being able to be familiar with all the different types of fitness and camps and ways of working out is super important, because you're always going to find people where certain things are useful, but certain things are not.
Totally.
Yeah. And everything that we just talked about for the last hour or so about helping fill the jar, if we circle back to the first example we talked about, when it was the person sitting next to you telling you that they want more muscle or they want to adjust their body composition, if we can pick apart why, we know exactly what we need to fill that jar with, and the likelihood that the client gets where they want to be is going to be as high as it possibly could.
Right.
Your program's only going to be as good as your client. So getting to know your client, learning their why, learning everything you can about them is only going to make your program, that much better and more efficient.
Right. I like it.
So, Kiefer, if anybody wanted to digest content that you're putting out, where can they find it?
I'm relatively active on Instagram. It's just at Kiefer Lammi. Mostly these days, I just post pictures of my food bowls, but hopefully I'll get back to some regular content soon. And then, I just launched a new website for my business. So if they want to find me there, it's strongerxdesign.com.
Awesome. You going to move to TikTok anytime soon? Start doing those dances?
I literally just got a message from somebody this morning saying that I needed to get on TikTok, and I don't know that I can do it.
I don't know if your clientele's hanging out on TikTok, so you might be all right.
Thanks a ton for having me, guys. This was fun. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, we really appreciate your time, man. Thanks for helping us learn a little bit about the way you do things.
Of course.
As always, you can find Resilient Training Lab on Instagram as Resilient Training Lab. We're also www.resilienttraininglab.com. Thank you for listening to our podcast. If you enjoyed yourself, please leave a 5-star review, 5-star reviews only. And we look forward to hearing from you guys about your thoughts on the episode, and we'll see you next time.